When the masses begin to starve, that's when we're going to experience full-on, real-life SHTF situations across the planet. So far in 2020, more and more people find themselves without enough food to eat throughout the day. And this pandemic has caused a huge amount of implications when it comes to the food supply around the world as a whole. So stick around for the rest of the video. We'll talk about what the numbers are starting to tell us about this food crisis that we're facing and why we need to prepare for full-on SHTF if this food supply crisis doesn't improve. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and today we're talking about how the food crisis in 2020, thanks to implications from the pandemic, is starting to come to a point of no return. We're finding ourselves in a very bad situation when it comes to food shortages around the planet. And when you compare the numbers to what they were in 2019, you can see that the pandemic itself has definitely had a huge effect on the ability for most people around the world to feed themselves on a regular basis. And what we're finding is that the longer this pandemic goes on and the longer that the year of 2020 seems to drag on, the more we're going to find ourselves facing food shortage crises everywhere you look, okay? So the starving masses are going to be a huge problem when it comes to an SHTF scenario. And you might be one of those people unless you've been storing food away properly as up to now. Everyone should be storing food right now and should have been storing food even before everything began. But if this pandemic and this crisis we've been going through hasn't taught you that you need to store food and make sure that you have the ability to feed yourself and your family for a long amount of time without having to rely on any other kind of assistance, then you haven't been learning very much from the situation. This is going to be a big problem. And the problem that we're all going to face, and the thing that we really need to watch out for, is that these food shortages haven't even begun yet when it comes to the supply line and when it comes to what you're able to feed yourself with right now. The kink in the hose that started this problem back in early 2020 hasn't begun to let the flow of the water out of the nozzle yet. We haven't seen the food shortages actually hit as hard as they are eventually going to, because we have residual stockpiles still allowing us to maintain some decent level of resources when it comes to being able to eat. However, that will come to an end at some point, and we will see what these implications actually begin to show us at a certain amount of time once this whole thing starts to resolve itself, okay? So quickly, if you are worried about feeding your family and feeding yourself through an SHTF scenario, and you don't want to have to rely on anybody else but yourself, hit the subscribe button below, because we're trying to stay self-sufficient and we're trying to stay ahead of these issues, so that way when something bad happens and this food shortage finally rears its ugly head and we finally feel it in person at our grocery stores and in our pantries, we're not going to be the ones who are starving in the streets, okay? So just to give you some reference points, 8.9% of the world's population was starving in 2019. Now the estimates is that that number is somewhere closer to 10% of the world population at this point in time. The reason for that is because of weather events and because of crumbling economies. A lot of people don't realize that food crises start when the economies that usually prop up the agricultural industry and prop up the production of that food product start to crumble. The economy has a huge effect on the ability for any country to produce when it comes to food. And right now our economy is in shambles. It might not look like it in the stock market, but if you think that the amount of businesses that have closed and the amount of people that are out of work and the amount of different logistics that have had to change due to the new norms instituted by this pandemic aren't going to completely wreck our economy, then you're mistaken. And this whole hyperinflated stock market we're dealing with right now is all based on futures and based on people who are basically inflating their own shares in order to continue a progressive growth model that isn't something we can actually sustain. But regardless of that, when economies crumble, food supplies crumble as well. And our economy is on its way out, as well as our food supply. So we're going to see the impacts of the food shortage even escalate further once the economy starts to fall apart, okay? So the full effects of the pandemic on the food supply have not yet been felt, but they are on their way. And this is coming from sources from all over the place, whether or not it's the World Economic Forum, whether or not it is the BBC, whether or not it's the mainstream media here in the United States. It doesn't matter where you look, you will find information regarding the situation at hand, okay? 265 million people are starving now due to implications of the pandemic. Not because they were starving before necessarily, not because they weren't able to get themselves out of poverty at a different time in their life, but because of whatever the side effects that this pandemic had when it came to either their local economy or their ability as a person to feed themselves. Those implications have now pushed 265 million more people towards starvation. That's a really big number. That is really big. It's 2/3 of the US population. And that is something we should all be concerned about, because could you imagine if 2/3 of the people in your town and your community were starving? That would not go well. That is a full-on SHTF scenario that we have to watch out for, okay? So we have to remember, the economy is tied directly to any type of food crisis. Think of the Great Depression. The Great Depression had a lot of starving families produced from the combination of extreme weather events such as the Dust Bowl situation and the economic failure of the United States at that time. And because of those combination of items, people were starving, waiting in bread lines, trying to keep their families fed. And that is going to be a similar situation to what we see here if things keep progressing towards a downfall. And the International Monetary Fund, they currently now are saying that the recession we're experiencing due to the pandemic is worse than that of the conditions during the Great Depression. And that's something we have to watch out for because, like I said, economy is food shortage. We have to be careful there. And they're telling us right now that it's going to be at least a 2-year recovery period to get back on track or get back to any sense of normalcy compared to what the economy was before all of this. So we're talking about a 2-year period of time where more and more people are going to find themselves without enough food on the table, okay? More and more people will not be able to feed themselves at a rate that they need to sustain a healthy life. And that is what we're going to experience over these next 2 years as long as the International Monetary Fund is accurate in what they're trying to say. 2 years to recover this economy means 2 years of it going further down, which means 2 years of food shortages continually escalating, okay? So we have to remember that as preppers, as people who are worried about survival and trying to stay out of the fray, that food is security. Food is keeping you alive when others are starving, and you have to maintain your food stocks in order to make sure you don't find yourselves on the wrong end of that food crisis. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that these are big numbers. When you're talking about 265 million people, yes, worldwide, that number doesn't feel as big. But if you were to compare it to just living here in the United States, that'd be 2/3 of everyone you know in your entire life starving. And imagine the SHTF scenario that would unfold if 2 out of every 3 people were starving to death, okay? You and I, if we aren't starving, are targets. You and I are going to be people who they envy because our families are eating. We're well fed. And if 2 out of 3 people suddenly decide that they're going to eat too and doesn't matter to them what happens to you or I in the process, that is going to be a big problem. And desperation is what turns most people into monsters at the end of the day. And that desperation is going to increase the hungrier somebody gets. And if your family was starving, you would do whatever you had to do to feed them, wouldn't you? So this is why this is important. The food shortage is not just about not being able to feed yourself or not being able to eat. The food shortage is also about the economic crisis at hand and the fact that the economy is crumbling along with our food supply. And it's about security and maintaining the fact that you and your family might be well fed, but that doesn't mean you're safe, because if you're the only ones well fed, you're going to find yourselves having some problems. So that's why we need to keep an eye on the food shortage situation instead of ignoring it and hoping it goes away the same way everyone is doing with this pandemic. We have to keep an eye on it. We have to stay ahead of it. And I do food videos every so often to remind you all that yes, there's a lot of things when it comes to prepping that you have to try to get. You have to get power, you have to get security, you have to get water supply, but food is huge and it takes up a lot of space and a lot of resources to get enough of it to sustain a family for a long period of time. but it's fully worth the investment because you do not want to be part of the starving masses who become a real problem when this all starts to unfold. So if you have anything else to add about the food shortage that we're on our way towards and that we haven't even fully experienced yet, let me know in the comments. I want to know. I want to know what your thoughts are and what you're doing to prepare for what's inevitably happening, okay? And if you don't even think there is going to be a food shortage, let me know that too, because you know what? Some of you are maybe on the side of thinking that a lot of this is just hyped and a lot of this is just put out there to keep us in line or to keep the fear up or whatever it might be. And you know what? Maybe you're right. I don't know. I'm not 100% guaranteeing anyone anything because, you know, things change so quickly these days that I'm always open to an opposite opinion, and I'm always open to at least entertaining other ideas to make sure that I stay as well-rounded and as open-minded as possible when it comes to preparing for the things that I see on the way. So, if you have anything else for me, comment below. Otherwise, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.